guys, and welcome back to the HJW Gaming channel and a continuation of my faction guides. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at our first evil faction in Rhun. So Rhun, I would say, is one of the lesser played evil side factions, which I think comes down to the fact they don't have a huge place in the lore, particularly the film lore. So new players decide to go for factions such as Mordor or Angmar instead, which they know from watching the films. Despite this, Rhun can be a very powerful and very good faction if you give them a chance. The starting commander given to players who choose Rhun in Season 1 is Khaldun. Khaldun is probably the best Tier 1 commander on the game, who makes particular use of evil men units. He is very strong at tiling, with skill trees such as Marshal of the Eastmark and also the Easterling skill tree, providing good damage reduction buffs as well as damage buffs so that he can take tiles without taking too many losses. Whilst he doesn't have a heal skill, he is seen as one of the better tilers from the evil side. In PvP battles, he again absolutely excels for exactly the same reason, in that he's brilliant at buffing his troops to take much less damage whilst dishing more damage out to the opponent. Additionally, the evil men units that he commands are particularly useful for fighting against the good side, as you see a lot of mounted units on the good side, whereas using evil men units allows particularly good use of the anti-cavalry units, such as the halberdiers, which he can buff to the absolute max, so he's particularly good when fighting against the good side. On top of that, he has an enormous number of very good skills which can buff both his troops but also his commander damage, so therefore if you get him to really high respect levels, he just goes from level to level and just keeps on getting better, which can't be said for all commanders in the game. And of course, being a tier 1, it's much easier to get that respect level through the respect items which are more common. His Respect 10 item, Fang of the East, in my opinion is not worth picking up. Whilst it does buff his might and speed, as well as the speed of his evil men, there are better items out there which you can use to buff your evil men units and improve your damage. Fang of the East limits you pretty much to only using him against mounted units, which is not what we'd like to do. At the start of the game, Rhun begins with the Eastern Quarters, which allows the use of evil men units, such as the Halberdier and the Dragoon. The Tier 1 and Tier 2 versions of these units are very good at the early game, as they possess pretty high HP and defense stats for this level of the game, so they're particularly good at keeping units alive when you're taking tiles. The Pikeman is also very cheap whilst having decent stats, though the Marauder, whilst it does allow you to buff through the mounted skill to reduce the damage taken, it is much more expensive due to being a mounted unit. So you'll primarily find that early game you'll be using the Pikeman unit more than anything else. Overall, the evil men are just very balanced units. For early game siege, however, these units aren't particularly great, with the majority of them only possessing around 15 siege, so you're not going to be doing huge amounts of siege damage too early. The second quarters unlocked by Rhun is the Morgul quarters, which allows use of the Orcish units. These don't particularly synergize that well with Rhun, as almost none of the Orc units provide any benefits when used with the evil men, or particularly the evil men commanders. Though the scout layer can provide some very fast units to allow you to move around the map a little bit quicker if that's what you need to do, or primarily just for scouting enemy tiles. The third quarters unlocked by Rhun is the Uruk quarters, which allows the use of the Uruk-hai. This is where Rhun finally starts to kick off, where you unlock the extremely powerful and probably most popular evil unit, the Alchemist, and of course where you start to finally get some really good siege damage. By the time you've unlocked this quarters, you should be just getting towards the point where you can start taking some larger keeps, and of course that siege damage is almost timed perfectly to allow you to take the bigger keeps. And the last quarters unlocked by Rhun is the Northern Quarters, which allows the use of the Angmar-based Orcish units. The split of the primary Orcish units being between the second and fourth unlock is why I'd say that Rhun is not the best place to play if you're looking to use Orcish commanders such as Gorbag or Gothmog, as it will take you quite a long time to unlock the best Orcish units. In the Morgul quarters, you'll have use of the Crusher and the Tracker. However, if you're using these commanders, what you really want to output your damage is the Reaper unit, or potentially even the Morgul Arbalest if you're using someone like Sunind, which of course you can't do until you've unlocked this 4th quarters, so you won't be fully operational until quite late in the game. So if you're looking to play Rhun, make sure you have your Evil Men commanders at the ready, so Khaldun and also Black Serpent, and try and get them running as soon as possible. Of course, having universal commanders such as the Witch King can never hurt either, though you won't unlock his main strength through the Uruk quarters until your 3rd unlock. The unique tier 4 unit available to Rhun is the War Chariot. The War Chariot is an Evil Men unit, no surprise there, which possesses 3 different skills. One of them is Reap, which allows additional damage against melee units up to 20%. Scythes, which allows in round 1 and 6, against 2 enemy targets you deal physical damage and also inflict a bleed. On top of that, these are also one of the few units that carry the pursuit effect within their own unit. And also it's classified as a large unit, so you can reduce the amount of physical damage you take. Of course, though, you can also be countered by units that do big damage against large units. In my opinion, the War Chariot is one of the worst T4 units available. Whilst it does have some very niche uses and can be reasonably well used by Evil Men commanders, generally, even by people who play Rhun, they won't be used too often. On commanders such as Kiran, who's a commander who buffs Evil Men massively, you'll find that your Halberdiers will do much more damage than your War Chariots and are significantly cheaper. So in my opinion, they are not the best unit that you could use. The biggest issue with these is that their skills just don't synergise well with the commanders. So for example, inflicting a bleed is almost pointless as there's no commanders to take advantage of that bleed effect in roleplay, this should be said. Particularly early seasons, I know there's a bit more in the later seasons that can do that. Plus the Reap taking out melee units can be useful and can counter certain units, but it just doesn't have the defensive capability to stay alive long enough for that to be useful. And also it being a large unit actually makes it too easily counterable, as most good side run units that can counter against large units. So therefore, in my opinion, the War Chariot just isn't strong enough to make it viable in roleplay, to justify the cost that you spend conscripting these units. The unique ring skill available to Rhun, which is Walker of the Sands, can be unlocked after level 50 and increases your damage by 12% when battling on desert lands. In my opinion, this is one of the worst ring buffs again. It's not particularly great at anything. You'd like that damage early game, so you could use it to take tiles when you're located in Rhun lands. However, unlocking it after level 50 makes it only really useful if your faction ends up on the heavy defensive, trying to recover your own territories and pushed back into Rhun lands. In which case then, yes, you'll be on desert tiles and that damage buff will come in. But almost everywhere else on the map, there are no desert tiles, so it'll have no use at all, and you'll be coming up against other factions whose ring buffs, say such as LOTR, which have huge use and will give them a massive advantage in the PvP combat. The location of Rhun can be both a great strength and a weakness. Located in the far east of the map, pressed against the eastern border, Rhun therefore finds itself protected from several sides, particularly the east, due to the border of the map. In early seasons, it has very few nearby enemies to worry about. To the north, but very close to the north, you will have Erebor, and to the south, you will have Mordor. Sometimes you will also see Rohan or Gondor pushing up to the west, but they're not close enough at the beginning of the game. After Season 2, you see the very popular evil faction, the Variags, and they're then placed at the south, pressed right against Rhun lands. Though of course, whilst there are few enemies pressed up against you, potentially only 1 or 2, these factions, Variags, Erebor, Mordor, are all some of the most popular factions in the game, so you can guarantee they'll always be very, very populated. So if you're going to play as Rhun, you have to make sure you join as an existing strong faction, prepared to take on at least one of these factions, as it's likely they're going to head your way pretty quick in the early game, due to the proximity of your two factions in search of tiles. As far as neutral keeps go, there is quite a good variety available to Rhun, particularly considering you can only really travel across to the west, north, or slightly to the south. There is nearby the Selderwyn Vale Keep, which is a low power keep, which tends to be taken by Rhun early on. From then on, you can also move towards Ashen Plains if you're looking for another 160 power keep. Or then, of course, you have Daggerlad and Dorwinion if you're looking towards 600 power keeps. As far as 1000 power keeps, you also have Withered Gardens and a Greater Rhun nearby, though there's nothing really 760 unless you're looking to push heavy into Erebor territory and take Carnan Vale. The issue, of course, with these neutral territories is all the surrounding factions will also be looking to get there too. The Rhun capital, Kindland, isn't particularly well placed if looking from a defensive standpoint. Approach from the south is protected by several tunnels, which you can use to bottleneck the opposition, though these are only regular tunnels and nothing like a critical crossing, for example. And to the north again, there's only a single crossing leading into Greater Rhun, so if Erebor decide to push down through this way, they can get very easy access to your capital. There are also very few defensive choke points which you can use to make a final stand, which again kind of reinforces how poor that ring skill is, as if there were several places you could make a stand with desert tiles, your extra damage from the ring skill might come into play and allow you to successfully defend, but with only a couple of very basic level crossings, it's unlikely you're going to be able to do this. So therefore I think defensively, Kindland is one of the worst positioned capitals in the game, despite the fact that it's pressed right up against the eastern border. As far as positioning yourself for a ring fight goes, Rhun is pretty well placed. You only have to capture the low-powered Keldwyn Vale and then the 1000 power East Bight Keep to have access to Amon Lanc. Though it should be said that this access is to the eastern side of Amon Lanc, whereas Dol Guldur lies on the far west. So of course, if you are going for a battle for the ring, you will have longer reinforcement times than those coming from the north, such as Erebor or Loth, or from the south, such as Rohan. But you still don't have the issues such as, Linden, Angmar, etc., where you're placed a million miles away from the ring and will really struggle to get access without taking multiple territories. You only have to take 2, and then you're there in Amon Lanc. Resources available to Rhun, again, is pretty weak and can be one of the worst things about being in Rhun. The desert land leads itself to have very few grain or lumber tiles, with a reasonable number of ore or stone tiles, but again, nothing like that which is possessed in the tundra by Erebor. Therefore, it can be hard to find large patches of strong resources if you're playing as Rhun. The primary location for Rhun resources lies in the Little Treasure Islands just to the east and southeast of Kindland, where the little islands possess huge numbers of grain tiles, though not enough for your whole faction to share around. So therefore Rhun is forced to expand outwards to look for tiles which are not placed on desert land for resources, which again just completely wastes and doesn't use that ring skill. Therefore Rhun can be a little bit slow to get up and running, particularly as to access its densest cluster of resources you have to cross several crossings, so you have to be capable of taking the armies and dealing the siege. Once this is up and running, you do have a reasonable stock of resources, though not as strong as some of the other factions in the game. Neutral units are once again very, very poor in Rhun. I feel like I'm repeating myself here. Everything about Rhun at the minute I'm just assessing as being very poor. Neutral units, there's basically nothing in Rhun. All of the strong neutral units are placed in other areas, such as the Great Beasts, which are located in the traditional Variags territory. Half-Trolls, again, possessed in Variags territory, or the Fell Beast, which are in Mordor territory. So if you're looking to get access to neutral units, you're going to have to push into the land of another faction and into likely war, unless you're united or allied with these factions. For levelling your commanders, Rhun's location is somewhere between mediocre and poor, depending on where you spawn. If you spawn, say, around Kindland or to the east of Kindland, there's plenty of crossings and tunnels which you can use to farm XP on your commander by repeatedly hitting these crossings' armies. However, if you spawn further north, towards Carnan Vale or in the top of Greater Rhun, there are almost no crossings at all, and not a lot of neutral units, so you're left to farm in the traditional way just by taking stronger and stronger tiles, which is reasonably inefficient when compared to other factions such as LOTR, which can farm the Eagles and the Ents and many tunnels and crossings from very early on. So therefore you may find yourself at an early level disadvantage if you get into an early war. In summary, in my opinion, Rhun is not for the faint of heart, and definitely should only be attempted by experienced players. Whilst evil men units can be strong for early game, the mid-game disadvantage of lack of levelling through lack of neutral units, tunnels and crossings means that experienced players must know how to level up efficiently and make sure they're active at all times to get their levels up and not fall behind. Additionally, very experienced leadership is needed to make sure you don't go to early war on multiple fronts, potentially with Variags, Erebor and even Rohan and Mordor. So your leaders need to make sure their political negotiations are completely on point to stop you getting overwhelmed right from the beginning of the game. Though of course victory from under these potentially challenging conditions can make it feel all the sweeter. And anyway, with that, that's the end of my Rhun faction guide. If you have any comments on the points I've made here, or any disagreements, please drop them down in the comments box, and I do read every comment and reply. If you've enjoyed the video, please drop a like, and please consider hitting subscribe, as I do release regular Rise to War videos. And if you do choose to do that, I really hope to see you on the next one.